Good evening. My name is Ty Jones, and tonight I will be explaining why U.S. law enforcement's current use of force is not needed and why better de-escalation policies are needed. To start off tonight's presentation, I want to give an agenda of what I plan to cover. The first thing is a brief recap and history of U.S. law enforcement officers. From there, I plan to transition into present-day officers to see the difference between those officers of past and present. After introducing present-day officers, I plan to talk about what SWAT is and how it ties into present-day officers. After introducing SWAT, we need to discuss the problems with the use of SWAT. Right after that, I want to give a glimpse into the news with some recent incidents with the use of force and its overuse, but this will not include the Black Lives Matter movement for the sole reason that is a very controversial topic right now, and I do not want to include that for right now. After explaining some recent incidences in the news, we will discuss the problems with the current system of force, how it can be improved, and finally, the benefits of better de-escalation tactics. As we have learned in this class, the first police officers were known as constables. The American version of policing was modeled after London since we immigrated from England to America. A night watch was needed to protect people at night since nighttime was the most often time to have items stolen or crimes committed against others. Oftentimes, men had a rotational schedule and were not appointed or more of a firm role such as today's present officers. Most times, the wealthiest individuals in the colonies hired other criminals to protect their goods since the criminals already had the mindset of what other criminals may do to rob, hurt, or gain from stealing from others. Present-day officers have more of a military-style approach compared to the night watchmen of the past. Within present-day officers' ranks, there is more organization and an increase in the use of military tactics. The duties of present-day officers include peacekeeping, problem-solving, and maintaining order. Present-day officers keep the peace by utilizing their skills both learned at the police academy and judgment that they have built since childhood. Police constantly have to solve problems, if it's from cars that are speeding down the interstate to if a conflict escalates between two individuals, and determine who is at fault. One of the most heavily used tactics of current U.S. law enforcement is to maintain order. But since the skill has been overdeveloped, as we will see here later on, the use of force has become too much. Present-day officers are limited in the courts by how much force they are actually supposed to use. And if they cannot justify their actions of force, then they could still face legal ramifications or be terminated from the police force in some instances. One tool that present-day officers use is known as SWAT. Now, SWAT stands for Special Weapons and Tactics. This method was first used in the 1960s. It is a specific subset of a standard police officers and is more of a military approach than present-day officers. It was created to serve search warrants, take down active shooters, and handle terrorist threats. But as I will show here soon, they have been used for other purposes as well. Now, I wanted to show a brief clip of how SWAT actually uses force to enter homes, which is known as breaching. And I feel that this is going to be important as I explain later. As you can see, they swing their battering ram into the door jamb, which creates enough force to actually break part of the door around the lock itself, so then the door can swing in. Now, there are several problems associated with the use of SWAT, also with riot gear on officers. The first problem is that it provides too much force. It is simply an overuse of force. The second problem is that it can cause public panic. When people see officers dressed in tactical SWAT gear, it creates a cloud of worry for their own safety. The third problem is that SWAT is not needed in every situation, and I will explain this more in detail here soon. And finally, SWAT is simply overused today from its original founding purposes. The first news instance I want to discuss happened in Seattle, Washington. Protesters were gathered to speak their mind about how unhappy they are with the current system. One officer was cited as forcefully hitting the heads of protesters. Another was cited as punching a person 6 times violently in the face. And a third officer was cited as using their knees on the necks of 2 individuals. In all 3 citations, force was overused. If one of the main goals of the officers today is to maintain order and peace, then they stepped over the bounds by violently attacking the protesters who were only utilizing their Eighth Amendment of the US Constitution. The officers who used their knees on the necks of 2 individuals was an overuse of force. That is unethical police tactics and is never needed. There are other methods that can be used and should be used instead. Now, there is 2 sides to the story. Firstly, police could have seen needing the use of SWAT gear in order to protect themselves from the rioting and violence that could have happened. But people can also view the use of this tactical gear as threatening to them, and they could have been worried for their own safety. These circumstances escalated the situation further than it should have gone, and these issues would not have happened if better de-escalation tactics were used. The second news instance I want to discuss happened in Aurora, Colorado. An officer was fired after the excessive use of force. The officer was cited as using his taser for 27 seconds on a perpetrator. According to Ingberg, tasers deliver between 30,000 and 60,000 volts a second, and after 6 seconds, most adults would have been incapacitated and on the ground. Tasers can cause several medical issues. They can cause skin irritation where it is held against the person. They can cause small puncture wounds if it's a barb launching style of a taser, as shown in the image to the right. Tasers can cause minor burns where they're used, either held to the person or where the barbs actually implant themselves in the skin. And the main problem is that they cause violent muscle spasm, which in turn is how they actually work. That's how they incapacitate the individual, but they still could hurt the individual, especially if they had a heart condition. Now, the third news instance that I wanted to cover happened in Honolulu, Hawaii. A SWAT team broke into a captured suspect's home and used a flash grenade on the residents. The mother who was home with their child was standing by the door and with the keys in her hand, trying to open the door as it happened. This is why I felt it was necessary to show that how SWAT teams actually breach houses. This instance was an unnecessary use of SWAT and force because the suspect was already in custody, the spouse was trying to open the door, and there was a child in the house when that flash grenade was used. The flash grenade can give PTSD to that child for a long time and cause other medical issues such as blinding lights and deafening of the eardrums. The fourth and final news instance that I wanted to discuss actually happened in Buffalo, New York. Now, an elderly man was physically pushed over by police for no documented reason. Nearby police were onlookers as it happened. And it was only after he hit his head and started bleeding profusely that they worked hard to find him medical help. But this was an overuse of force because they shouldn't have pushed him down in the first place. This leads us into the problems with the current policing system. Now, as shown in these 4 instances, police's current use of force has become unnecessary and hurts others with and without reason. It is also causing normal situations to become dangerous to individuals. This is partly due to the fact that people are now scared of police officers because they are unsure what will actually happen to them. There is also a lack of clear communication between the officers and the public is unclear on what the police's judgment is in situations because of that lack of clear communication. Now, we can improve by revising core standards and tactics that are used by officers. We can reassess how and when we actually make arrests. We can reevaluate how officers approach individuals. We can utilize clear communication, and we can utilize better de-escalation tactics, which is why I'm searching that we need them. As I just mentioned, one way that we can improve is to revise core tactics and standards. So we can do this first by removing qualified immunity. Now, qualified immunity currently provides police officials with a pass from civil lawsuits. According to Williams, it provides ample protection to all but the plainly incompetent or those who knowingly violate the law. The second way that we could revise core standards is to get legislation to allow better data collection. Now, faulty data that is collected could lead to incorrect attempts to pursue individuals or even apprehend the correct individual. Questions that we cannot answer because we do not have the data would include, now, how many people have actually been injured by U.S. law enforcement officers? How many cases have prosecutors failed to file due to the lack of evidence? And finally, could police then access private security systems for use on a case if there was better data collection? Because currently, right now, private security systems cannot be accessed by police unless they have obtained a warrant. More resources are also needed for police training. If we can provide better equipment, better training on ethical police work, and more funding if it is required, then we can avoid incidences like the officer using their neck on the individuals and an overuse of force. We can also change when SWAT is actually required. As I mentioned previously, SWAT was created to serve search warrants, apprehend active shooters, and participate in work and terrorist threats. But as I also showed, it has been used for so much more than its original purposes. If we can go back and use it for what it was intended for, then this will help with the overuse of force and get us to the point that we could be using de-escalation tactics instead. And finally, changing when deadly force can actually be used, because it's not required in every instance and it shouldn't be an option in most cases. Another way that we can improve would be to reassess how and when officers can actually arrest individuals. Every incident is different. Some incidences could require different tactics. There is no cookie cutter approach that could be used from instance to instance. When the time is valid to arrest a perpetrator, less force would be better, and de-escalation tactics could tie into there, and they might be willing to go willingly as opposed to causing possible harm to themselves and the officers with a high-speed chase. Another way that we could improve would be to reevaluate officers' approach. So here on the left, we have Joe Smith. He looks like a nice officer. And then here on the right, we have Joe, who's now in riot gear. Now, which officer would you be more willing to comply with? The officer on the left or the officer on the right? Who would you feel safer being around? The officer on the left or the officer on the right? Now, I personally would feel safer with the officer on the left and would comply with the orders of both. I would feel more at risk of being hurt if I didn't comply with the orders for the officer on the right, as would most Americans. But the person on the left may be more willing to get people to comply with, and people would feel a lot safer around. One other method is that we could have clear communication. So in all of the situations outlined earlier, they could have been solved differently with the use of clear communication. For instance, in Seattle, protesters were simply utilizing their right to protest via the 8th Amendment of the US Constitution, but police went straight to a force approach by punching people in the face and then using their knees on the necks of two individuals. With clear communication, those uses of force wouldn't have needed to happen. And there could have been better de-escalation tactics utilized, including clear communication. In Aurora, Colorado, the police officer had used his taser for too long on the perpetrator. There could have been better communication used instead of that force, and he might not have been fired in the long run. In Hawaii, SWAT barged into a captured person's home. There was no need for the force since the perpetrator was already in custody, and the tenants of the house, the mother was trying to comply with the orders of the SWAT team and protect her child. The last thing I wanted to discuss tonight is the benefits that could be had if we had better de-escalation techniques. The first benefit would be the lower need for the use of deadly force. We'd be less prone to taking lives with better de-escalation tactics. This means that public morale would go up significantly, and also we wouldn't have news stories about people being hurt or killed due to ineffective police work. The second benefit would be to lower the need for the use of restraints. People would be more willing to comply with the orders of the officers, and thus restraints may not be needed as frequently. People may be willing to go with the officers if they understand it's just for questioning and they don't feel that they're going to go to jail if they go with the officer no matter what. The third benefit would be that there would be fewer reported injuries to both police officers and to the public. This would again help the public feel safer around the police officers, and it would allow then police officers to have a better feeling that they may go home at the end of the shift. Because a lot of officers go to work, but you never know what's going to happen. They may not return to their families at night. And with the world that we've become into, there are citizens who go out and may not come home at night because of some police officers. And so if we had better de-escalation tactics, then there would be fewer reported injuries to both sides and people could go home to their families and loved ones. The fourth benefit would be a lower arrest rate and would tie directly into the fifth benefit of having a minimalized effect on the US criminal system. So if there was less people arrested, then that will be less people that are in holding cells, in jails, in juvie, really just waiting to go through the court process as a whole, which would then save the public time, money, and there would be other benefits as well. And here are all of my references. I wish to thank you for your time tonight here listening to my presentation. I will take questions in the chat box to the right on Bongo. Please feel free to reach out and ask me, though, if you would like to ask a question privately one-on-one. I will do my best to get back and answer them as I see them. Thanks.